Okay, so welcome to our new series of the month, Future Proofing Your Education and Career series. And our first of the month is going to be a path to international development and the future of aid work with my close friend and colleague, Rahul. Rahul, let's get your mic off. You have your mic still on. I think you might have your mic still off. There we go. Rahul, maybe a quick introduction about yourself, and then we'll jump quickly straight into it.
Thank you, Hamada. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our viewers, wherever in the world they are. So as Hamada mentioned, my name is Rahul Srinivasan. I work with the World Bank and I'm based in Washington, D.C. Just as a quick introduction, my background is in energy. I'm an electrical engineer who went on to study public policy before joining the World Bank. I work extensively on energy access in sub-Saharan Africa, and specifically on how last mile health centers in sub-Saharan Africa can be electrified to improve human capital development in terms of healthcare and education, as well as fight the current Corona-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. I've known Rahul for quite a while. We were colleagues together at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and I thought he would be a perfect person to kind of kick off this whole series, especially given that there's so many transitions and pivots that he has done over the course of his career so far. And I love the fact that he was able to put together a sense of policy within the scope of engineering and be able to project that in the world. Most of his work is done in Africa, and you're going to learn a lot more about Rahul over the course of this webinar. Just for your information, as I said, we're going to be doing these webinars over the course of the month. We're going to be covering business and small businesses and businesses in general with MBAs. We're going to be covering medical school, talking to potentially doctors and people in the medtech field. And then finally covering the legal field from possibly both a law firm perspective as well as a small entrepreneurial legal perspective over the course of the month. So really covering all the main areas that we cover here at Right Track. Again, MBA, law, college in some sense. A lot of these talks will be covering college-related stuff, as well as graduate school and medical school, which is a new mainstay for the company. So without further ado, I want to kind of kick it off, go into it, and I want to talk a little bit about what exactly is future proofing. Now, some people may not necessarily know what future proofing is, and I thought it would be worthwhile to quickly discuss this and give you guys some context. So basically, future proofing, as you guys are seeing right over there in the slide, is used mainly, and it was primarily discussed as a mechanism of learning about or discussing technology. And so by definition, according to the dictionary, it says to design software on a computer, et cetera, so that it can still be used in the future, even when technology changes. So the idea of Moore's law from a technological perspective is that within 18 months, everything is pretty much obsolete in terms of technology. So how do you basically prevent from that? You create what is called future proofing. However, what I'm finding is that future proofing is not limited just to the technology space, but really should be considered and thought about when it comes into your own careers, your own education, your own personal development, how to make it future proof. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about over the course, as I said, of the month, is talking about future proofing as a concept as it relates to your education and your career and your career and your education and your education back to your career, right? Because you may start with an undergraduate degree and future-proof that, then go into your career, future-proof that, then go back into your to graduate school, and then go back to your career, and who knows, go back to graduate school. Similar to how I did it. I was a college student, worked, graduate student, worked again, graduate student again, and then now I'm working. So you never know when you kind of go back and forth, and whatever you're doing, you're trying to future-proof it. So looking at that, the first thing I want to kind of relate to is there's a famous article written by Joseph Owen, who I believe is the dean at the University of Northeastern University in Boston. And he came up with the concept of robot proof, the idea that people themselves will be able to be, I guess, digitally not enhanced, but they're going to be literate in how they are able to better understand the world around them, where they are way up to speed and prevent robots from taking over their positions. So they prevent that kind of obsolete, I guess, shedding of jobs because your job now is rendered unessential or rendered, people are, I guess it's not even required or necessary anymore because robots can fill that role. So how do you robot proof your own job, your own career path? And within that, you kind of also want to be thinking about, again, about digital literacy. What do you need to know to be ahead of the curve, to be forward leaning in terms of computer technology and so forth? So what you want to do, for example, if you can see by that graph I have up there, which was a great graph from the Data Never Sleeps 6.0 report that I pulled up. I mean, just check out how many awesome, amazing things we are doing in terms of how much technology we are accessing on any given period. In this case, it's a day. So, and this is a while back. I think this is like last year. Obviously, this has changed a lot since we've been stuck at home through COVID, but you can see how many different things are changing, how many people are accessing different types of technologies over the course of a given day. So that's an important factor to know and to be up to date and up to speed on all things related to digital literacy, to be able to prevent you from your job being taken over by robots, so to speak. That is future-proofing your own career path, your own education. Also, the concept of co-collaborating, interoperability, working across different functions, but also amongst different people, and the concept of design thinking. Rahul, I'll throw it to you as well, because I'm sure you know design thinking well. We, I think, discussed this at length at Harvard. I know it's a concept that came out of Stanford as well. But the idea, and I'm sure you do this at the World Bank, come together with people who are not just engineers, but policymakers, folks who are doctors, people who are lawyers, business people, come together to be able to solve, certain ideas and social ills. And we're seeing that right now classically with the ventilators, right? There was a huge push amongst many folks to be able to come together and create technology that we can do in our homes or in our cities and so forth. That really brought together a lot of different minds to create a affordable and effective ventilator, for example, during COVID. I'm sure you've come across this at the World Bank.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think at the World Bank, the focus has always been on multidisciplinary collaboration. It's impossible for an energy professional like me to address the COVID-19 pandemic just with my qualifications and my experiences. We've been constantly collaborating with health colleagues at the World Bank, but not only internally, Hamada, it's also, I would say, the external part of it, right? In terms of external organizations that the World Bank is working with. We're looking at WHO, we're looking at Gavi, we're looking at UNICEF. I guess it's multidisciplinary collaboration, not only internally, but also with external partners. So when we're looking at ventilators, for instance, what is important to note is that many of these ventilators or oxygen concentrators cannot necessarily function without electricity. So even if you're a health professional, you could probably design these ventilators and oxygen concentrators, but if you don't have the power to actually electrify them, they're not necessarily going to work. So further to your point, this really makes the case for people to be comfortable working with folks from other backgrounds. It's a necessity.
Exactly. And I think that also comes into that kind of the concept you've mentioned, this of cross functionality, working not just in your silo and just the way that you operate and what you know, but being able to understand what the other person's thinking preempted, also understand what the other person's thinking and co-collaborate on it in a cross-functional capacity. So that's a very important part to stay relevant and to stay marketable. And the other aspect of it is the upskilling and the reskilling, right? You can't just go in there like you were an engineer, but then you realized an engineering may be limiting in a certain capacity. So you went into the policy aspect. You did a lot of courses that covered a lot of different areas. I remember it at Harvard. And we'll talk more about that when we get into your background. But I think that was a very important aspect of how you were able to pivot. So you weren't just typecast as just an engineer, but an engineer wearing multiple hats. I talk about staying local, which is what we're doing. but still thinking globally, right? Because that's exactly what Rahul's doing. He may be in Washington, D.C., near the World Bank, but his work, his focus is also focused on sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and different parts of the Middle East and so forth. And the same from my perspective. Even though I'm in Los Angeles, I'm always thinking globally, even though I'm based locally. And you want to keep thinking about that, because in the end of the day, if jobs run out in America, or obviously I hope that doesn't happen, or there's lots of unemployment or what have you, you can always pivot and get those jobs, even if you're based locally, on a global level. So always think about it in that way. I also say stay ahead by following professionals, industry leaders, and the economic trends, so that you have a better sense of what's happening around you, right? If some people probably, maybe even at the World Bank, and we'll speak about this more, Rahul, maybe got a sense of it in January, that things were a little bit, going haywire. And so they were already making plans and thinking about how, they're going to be able to work with their staff if they're going to be based remotely, how they're going to still be able to carry out work and so forth on an international scale. So if you're ahead of it, you're not going to be surprised by an economic swing, because you've been reading and following the trends and following the people that you want to follow on LinkedIn. That's a classic feature of LinkedIn, right? Is just following the different people and seeing what they're saying and so forth. So that's very important. And then obviously the obvious one is network to stay relevant. I mean, just what I'm doing over the course of even these series is reconnecting with colleagues and friends, bringing them on the show, learning about new things. They connect me to other people, so I learn more about what other people are doing, and just, again, staying relevant and staying in tune. So these are all very important features of not only about your education. We talked about the robot proof and the necessity of universities to make their curriculum more in tune with the changes that's happening in society and so forth, and the idea of digital literacy on an academic level, but the co-collaboration, interoperability, working and design thinking from an educational perspective, and using that to pivot into a career where you're using a cross-functional capability, you're constantly reskilling and upskilling, you're staying local, going global, and you're staying ahead of the curve by networking and following other people. So that's a lot of information there on future proofing, but I think it's going to lay a great foundation for us to be able to better understand the conversation with Rahul and the future conversations that we'll have. And I'll hopefully be able to kind of bring the slide back in again for the next webinar. So again, that this concept keeps staying fresh in your head. So let's keep moving along and go to the next slide. So Rahul, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that kind of transition that you had from purely an engineer studying in India to being able to be a World Bank official working in Washington, D.C.
Sure. Thank you, Amada. I guess before I talk about my journey, I think one of your earlier points really resonated when you spoke about being globally focused. So I come from Mumbai, the city of Mumbai in India. I'm a very proud Indian, but there's this really nice hoarding inside the airport, which says Indian at heart and global in spirit. And it is something that I've always, kind of admired. We are all proud citizens of our respective countries, but we cannot ignore the problems that we face on a global scale. So our mindset should always be in terms of not only responding to emergencies in our own countries, but also at a global level. So I think it's fine to be a very proud citizen of your country, but I think being global in spirit is really the essence that has driven my journey, moving from an engineer to the World Bank. So every time I go back to Bombay or when I'm flying out of Mumbai, that hoarding always reminds me as to why I have undertaken this journey. So I guess moving forward, Hamada, as you mentioned, I started as an electrical engineer. My undergraduate studies in Mumbai were in electrical engineering, and then even my first master's at Wisconsin-Madison was focused on electrical engineering. It was a role I really enjoyed. I did this for a good 4 to 5 years. But then what really kind of motivated me to take the next step was this feeling that what I had learned as an engineer should be used for a more broader cause, right? I mean, I was happy being an engineer, but I really wanted to leverage those technical skills to do something which was more satisfying to me, something which meant more to me. So at that point, I was based in the DC area, was aware of many of these international organizations, including the UN, including the World Bank. I met with a lot of friends and well-wishers from these institutions, and realized that probably one thing that I lacked was a professional background, or maybe even a academic background in international development or in policy. I think the engineering part is great because it brings in technical expertise, which is essentially needed for anything that you're going forward with. And I'll discuss this a little bit later in terms of technical expertise or subject matter expertise. But I think what I wanted to do was combine that expertise with some information or some background on international development and public policy in terms of what I could use my skills towards. Hamada, you mentioned networking, and I think I know this is often used as a buzzword, but I think more than networking, it's really for yourself to understand where you fit and what you need to do to get to the next stage, right, in your life. When you talk about future proofing, I think a lot of it is really meeting with people who have been there and done that, right? It's critical. I think you don't need to reinvent the wheel in terms of what needs to be done. A lot of people have probably gone through the journey that you've been through. So I think future proofing is a lot about talking to these people to understand what they have done and what you can do to kind of follow their path or even create your own path. So in my case, I did a lot of this. I guess when I was, working as a private sector engineering consultant, working in the energy industry as a consultant, I spoke to tons of folks. What it led to was some pro bono political advocacy work I did in DC related to US-India energy trade. How we could expedite energy trade between these two democracies, between these two huge countries. And that then led me to go and study policy. So I went to the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where I met Hamada. I studied 2 years. These were terrific years. I think arguably the two best years of my life in terms of what I gained, what I learned about what I want to do moving forward. Getting back to your earlier point, Hamada, on meeting people from different backgrounds, I think I met people here that people of backgrounds that I'd never seen or envisioned in my life. But there were lawyers, there were folks who were refugees, refugee activists. I think it really broadened my horizons in terms of what I wanted to do. My first internship, I did 2 internships while I was at school. One was in the private sector and one was more in the public sector. One of my internships was with the UN. I was based in Vienna. And this is where I started working mostly on sub-Saharan Africa, looking at what challenges confronted the continent at large. Of course, it's a huge continent. It's difficult to paint the continent with one broad stroke. But I think if there is one issue that really confronts sub-Saharan Africa today, it is the energy poverty that we see, the lack of electricity, the lack of energy access. And it's not a standalone issue. I think when we talk about multidisciplinary issues, we must realize we live in a world today where one sector is so closely related to other sectors. So I can talk about electricity. So many schools and health centers in sub-Saharan Africa lack electricity. And I don't want to even get into how that impacts delivery of education and healthcare. Maternal care. We're talking about women giving birth to children under candlelight in the night, or even sometimes during the day when there's no electricity. So there's such a close, relationship between electricity and some of these other services that you have to work together. And this is something I really appreciated during my policy studies, during the UN, and then with the World Bank, where I've been working since 2017. I think it further drove home the point that electricity, like many other sectors or services, is a means towards an end, right? It's not an end. I need electricity to keep some of these SMEs running. I need electricity to deliver quality healthcare, quality education. So I think once that kind of really became, clear to me, it did 2 things. A, it made me further realize how important my work was, not only for professionals from the energy industry, but also for professionals from other industries. I think that was critical in understanding my journey and getting to where I am. Of course, talking to people, as I mentioned, super important for future proofing, because I would be lying if I said that I was the first one to make this transition. I was not. I spoke to a lot of other people who kind of defined this trajectory. And I think the second thing was really talking to people from different backgrounds, not only your background, because then it gives you an idea of how relevant your work is or how relevant your work can be in helping other sectors. But let me just complete this slide with a very important point regarding future proofing, since I understand that future proofing is one of the key themes around this session. So back in 2010, say 10 years back, if you had asked me, Rahul, did you ever think you would be at the World Bank in 2020? Did you ever think that you would be doing international development in 2020? The answer is a resounding no. I did not think about this in 2010. But if you ask me, Rahul, did you think about this in 2015, 2016? Yes, the answer is yes. And I guess where I'm getting at is sometimes we tend to overthink, right, in terms of what we want to do after 10 years or what we want to do after 15 years. The truth is, many of us may not have that vision or that exposure or that experience to think what we want to do after 10 years. Sometimes what makes sense is to think what you want to do over the next 1 to 3 years. Yes, it's good to have a long-term goal, no doubt about that. But I don't think it can consume you to the extent that you're getting dejected, thinking about that long-term goal. But if you think in steps, in terms of 1 to 3 years, I think life is much easier, and that's how I've kind of begun to think. What I want to do this particular year, or what do I want to do over the next 3 years? So when I joined the World Bank and International Development in 2017. I had given myself 2 to 3 years to see whether this is something that I wanted to do. Yes, I always knew I wanted to do it, but it's very different when you actually start working on something full time, right? Whether it's the World Bank or international development. Remember, I came from the private sector. So I gave myself 3 years. And today I've reached that 3 year mark where I'm very happy with what I'm doing, both in terms of the organization as well as the work that I'm doing. So I'm clear that I want to continue this for the remaining next 2 or 3 years. But now what I'm thinking is, all right, I started as an energy professional, but I clearly see myself being drawn more towards working with my health and education colleagues. And as I mentioned in my introduction, a lot of what I'm doing right now is kind of driving work in the energy sector to not only improve human capital development, but also respond to this COVID-19 pandemic, which has hit us like never before, right? Nothing like this. It's unprecedented. So this has kind of really become my passion now over the short term. Like, how do we want to, help diffuse this crisis? So I think that I would just want to leave this slide with that thought that sometimes don't overthink, for 10 years or 15 years. I think those long-term goals are good to keep, but really start thinking granularly in terms of what you want to do over this next year, over the next 2 years.
Yeah, and I think that's, thank you so much for that, Rahul. I think that was a great continuation. I want to ask you a couple of quick questions to kind of follow up on that. When you were at Harvard, what was the mechanism? How did you use the degree to help you pivot, to create that bridge to transition to the World Bank? Did you take, was it specific courses? Was it the people that you spoke with? Was it the internships that you did? Was it the research that you undertook? I remember you were my TA for PPPs, for private public partnerships. So I know you did a lot of work in that space as well. So what exactly was it that helped you get that transition so that you were able to jump ship?
Absolutely. I think it was very clear that I had enough experience in the energy field, right? I'd worked there. So I did not go to Harvard to necessarily strengthen my expertise in energy. I was looking at other aspects. As you mentioned, I was teaching while at HKS. I taught an energy class and then one class on public-private partnerships. But really, it was the skills around energy that I could leverage, in public policy work or international development work. So this included negotiations. I took a class on negotiations, which I think was really helpful in understanding how different sections of society think. So when you're looking at international development, when you're looking at public policy, what is very critical is how do you understand the environment around you, right? Because you're not working in a vacuum. You're not working just with energy professionals. You're trying to address problems that are beyond energy, and you're trying to address communities and this social landscape that may not be very obvious to you. So I think negotiations was great because in many cases we were doing role playing where I had to play roles that I was not necessarily familiar with, or I was responding to colleagues who came from a very different world that I did. So I think that was a great class, Hamad, in terms of understanding social landscape in which we work.
Right.
And in terms of the public-private partnerships class you mentioned, I took it in my first year and then taught it in my second year.
Right.
Again, very, very critical, because I think this is again a buzzword that is used, across the, political landscape or private sector landscape, public-private partnerships, because we realize that, public resources are scarce here, and there's a dire need to bring in the private sector to solve some of the problems that confront us, create a market for them. So
Right.
this private partnerships class was also excellent in terms of making me understand the social and political landscape that we live in. The next obvious step, Hamada, after taking some of these classes, whether it was negotiations or public-private partnerships. Sorry, there was another great class that I would mention before moving on. It was why are countries poor, unequal, and volatile. Again, a great insight into the times we live in, as to what separates a country from like Venezuela, from a country like Vietnam. Very different trajectories. What are their histories? What have been done by their leaders to bring them to the state that they're currently in? So again, a very, very important class to understand this landscape. I think once I took these classes, Hamada, there were two things that I did at HKS. I think one was trying to understand what my internship should be, because I feel these internships are critical, because many times they lead to full-time positions in many cases, because it's really a way for folks to judge you, because they are judging you, right? They are judging as to what you bring to the table before they give you a full-time position. So for me, it was the United Nations that I decided to intern with. And as a part of my future proofing, I did two internships. One with the UN, which was probably a couple of months, and then one with a private sector management consulting firm in Dubai. That was probably for a month. So I spent 2 months in Vienna and 1 month in Dubai. And I was future proofing, because I wanted to know which of these two tracks I would want to take after I graduate. I did not want to go into the blind. I did not want to take something which I had not dabbled with in the summer. So it was a bit of a risky move. Many people told me not to do a couple of internships, but I think it was the right decision. Because many times in life, it's sometimes difficult to know what you want to do. It takes time to get there. But sometimes the easier question to answer is what you do not want to do.
No, and I fully agree. I think that was something that I did, even though I had just graduated from law school. I always tell the story that I graduated from law school, started working at a law firm right in 2008 at the economic crisis, the last economic crisis. And then while I was at the law firm, a friend of mine came to me and said, that he was putting together this idea of creating an admissions consulting business. And I was working as an attorney, making a fairly decent income, but I wanted to, as I said, future-proof by taking on a side, I guess you could call it almost like a side hustle at the time, and then build it upon, build from there. And lo and behold, 9 months or maybe like 10 months later, I got laid off, and my admissions company grew and grew and grew. And next thing you know, I've had Right Track as my business, while I was working with the US government, while I was at the Kennedy School, and then grew it even bigger with a bigger team and so forth when I graduated from Harvard. So it's important to hedge and be able to look at things and don't take the same job, or let's put it this way, 2 jobs in the same field. That's not going to help you. But what you want to do is diversify your abilities so that if something fails, like even now during this COVID crisis, I'm an attorney. The work is not, it's still going, but we never know when somebody's going to say, well, we're going to cut back on legal costs and so forth. But I have the admissions business, and the admissions business propels, then I can always have my legal work as well. So it's always important to kind of hedge from there.
Absolutely. And I add another hedging point. It's not only the kind of work you're doing, but also in my case, I had spent 8 years in the US, and I was very clear that I did not want to intern in the US. So one of my internships was in Vienna and one was in Dubai, because these were geographies I had not worked in. But I wanted to keep myself open to moving there if that was an option.
Exactly.
So the internships, I think, were a great testing platform for me. And it's very clear to me after those 2 internships that I wanted to work in international development. So of course I had an offer with the UN after I graduated, but there was a competing offer with the World Bank. At that point, I decided to go with the World Bank offer. Both offers were great. There were certain reasons why I picked the World Bank at that point. But so to answer your earlier question, I think one thing which is critical is to understand if you're going, to study, is what are your strengths and what do you want to build, right? So I realized that I didn't necessarily have to take more energy classes. I taught those classes, but I clearly did not have much background in public-private partnerships or negotiations or classes on macroeconomics in terms of how countries are doing, why they're volatile, while some countries are doing well. So these were the classes that I took. And then when I combined that with my energy experience, it kind of became a very potent narrative that I could sell to recruiters. Because here they saw me as someone who had technical or subject matter experience in energy, but there was also someone who had taken these classes, which are not customary for energy professionals, who had a general sense of the political slash social slash economic landscape that I would be working in. So then it becomes a really potent combination. So that is another aspect of future proofing, right? I mean, you evaluate your strengths. I always look at it this way. People who reach out to me for job search, for to go to school, you want to tell yourself, I'm at point A. I want to go to point B. What is that bridge that takes me from point A to point B, right?
Right.
It's always that thinking which helps you understand what are your gaps, whether you're looking for jobs or whether you're looking to go to school. So sometimes you might realize, like in my case, that a formal academic background in public policy was that bridge to go from an engineering career to an energy career in the international development space. So I think this takes time. It doesn't happen in a day. It's really a process which spans sometimes months, a lot of reflection, a lot of talking to people. I mean, I don't use the word networking very callously here, but I do feel this goes beyond just talking to folks in your professional sphere, but also to your friends, right?
Right.
Because sometimes know what you better than most of these professional contacts. So I think it takes a lot of work internally as well as externally to understand what point B is for you and what that bridge can be.
Amazing. And I think that leads us into the commitment that you've made into the field of international development, which you've committed to for the last 3 years. And it looks like you're committed to for the next 2 years. And what I want to discuss here, and it's transition out of talking about your journey and the future proofing of your education and into the career that you have, is talking about your industry itself. There's a lot of listeners and questions that we've been receiving regarding the work, the future of aid work or humanitarian development or international development, whatever you want to call it. Where do you see that in terms of the future of that in a post-COVID situation? And I don't want to kind of just be limited in just the COVID crisis. I mean, there's been so many crises that have happened over the course of human history. They come, they go. Some of them change the landscape. Some of them don't. Some of them alter the way people think amongst each other. I would imagine COVID is kind of in between there so far. But I want to kind of just still say there was trends that were happening in 2018, 19, 17, and now 2020 and going forward. So maybe just tell us a little bit about, your experience of the World Bank and where do you see international aid moving along and the future of development?
Absolutely. I think one thing that defines international development is I think our mandate, responsibilities, and work actually increase manifold when we see a crisis, right? I mean, of course, the COVID crisis is the more recent one, but let's look at climate change, for instance, right? There's been so much written about it. It's slowly becoming a priority through these different COPs. But if you look at organizations like the UN, like the World Bank, so much of energy, so much of funding is being invested in climate change because we see ourselves as, agents who can kind of help deal with these crises that we've been seeing over the past few years. I genuinely feel that aid work, international development work, becomes even more important when we are dealing with these crises. So multiple reasons. Many of these crises are global in nature. I think international organizations have the bandwidth, and they have the relationships on the ground with these different countries to actually deliver a coordinated response, deliver a coordinated global response. So I think this is something which is very important. And what we're seeing is when you look at jobs today or careers today, we all know that many folks have unfortunately lost their jobs, are working in industries where there's a complete vacuum right now, where they don't know where it's going. But I think international development is one area, one field where you don't see that problem because in fact, we need more hands. We need more more better ideas on how to deal with the crisis such as COVID-19, climate change, education, energy poverty. I mean, and I think one thing I would like to point out is not all challenges are very visible, right? I mean, there are some challenges like climate change, like COVID-19, which are very in the public eye. So that these are problems that we're dealing with. But there's so many other issues. When you look at education, for instance, there's so many people, so many children in sub-Saharan Africa and many other developing countries did not have access to education. What sort of a society are we thinking of where people are not getting educated? I mean, to just put this in terms of numbers, I was reading this the other day. More than 2/3 of education facilities in sub-Saharan Africa do not have access to electricity, do not have access to basic amenities that can give children basic education services. That is also a huge challenge. It may not be in your eye because it's kind of being drawn out forever, right? It's not something which is current, but it is a challenge. So I feel international aid, international development work is only going to get more important with time because of where we stand on this in terms of having a global view or a global lens on what is going on.
Excellent. And I think that's very, very important. I know one of the things that you've mentioned in there in your slide was talking about careers and choosing which career path to go down. And I know that this is probably something that people are considering when deciding to go to graduate school or even to apply to college, is whether to choose a certain path that may be more future-proofed, more resilient to economic swings, maybe something more in the health and tech, maybe something more in the private sector, rather than doing something that is that would be in an industry that may, at this point right now, for example, the hospitality industry, maybe even sadly the airline industry in certain ways, the transport industry may not be necessarily the place that you want to develop most of your skill sets or really kind of commit to. But maybe in those areas, especially the technology and being ahead of that, and as it pertains to healthcare, are important areas. Are you seeing more people really kind of, how would I say, change their specializations or change their path because of this at the bank, who may have come in at an area that now, I know this happened in law, right? Some folks came in as real estate lawyers and then suddenly they start shifting their focus to bankruptcy. Maybe is there something like that, an analogous situation in international development, more specifically at the World Bank?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't restrict this response to the World Bank. Let me just kind of broaden my response. Amada, I get phone calls regularly about folks, in industries like tourism, as you mentioned, architecture, where they don't see any future, at least for the next 3-4 months. Right. I think what is critical is, clearly you want to do something that you're passionate about, right? You don't want to necessarily just move to something because it's selling like hotcakes or it's kind of in demand, because you won't necessarily be able to sustain a career there. I think the first critical point I want to raise to our viewers is you need to find something that you're passionate about, where you want to kind of solve something. Right. So that is critical. Like, you don't want to just go where you see demand, because it's not going to be sustainable. But what is critical is, let me give you an example. So one of my friends, right? He's an architect. Is obviously having a huge issue now with careers. But one area which interests him, which is very related to architecture, is energy efficiency, right? Sustainable energy, making sure that we are using our energy efficiently. Construction is happening in an efficient manner. Right. Now, if you look at this as a career, this could be far more sustainable, because a lot of international development work is moving in this space, because we are constantly trying to figure out ways in which we can be more energy efficient, both from a supply side and a demand side. So the lesson here is, I think you want to, our viewers need to think beyond 1 or 2 areas that interest them. Maybe put together like 3-4 areas. Obviously, I completely understand that you may not be equally passionate about all 4 areas, but if area 1 is currently not taking you anywhere, you might have lost your job, or you might just be on the verge of losing your job, or you don't know what to do. I think you want to look at some of the other areas that you're at least a little passionate about, and think for yourself how you see that industrial area playing out in the future. So, whether it's international development, or whether it's, working with governments. See, one thing with international development or working on the policy side is it can never go out of vogue because it generally gains traction when there is a crisis.
Right.
Whether we're talking about a government or whether we're talking about anything,
Right.
when there's a crisis, that's when you're needed because you need to formulate policies that can kind of mitigate the crisis. So
Right.
in broader terms, I feel if policy is something that interests you, I think it's great. I wouldn't restrict myself to just health, education, energy, or transport. I think everything has scope because you never know what crisis is going to hit you when.
Right.
But I think I think a very critical advice that I would give is you still need to stick to something that you're passionate about. So
Right.
think beyond the one or two key areas that interest you. But if those two key areas are not necessarily giving you results now, you need to think a bit beyond that.
Well, let's jump to our last slide and the last part of this conversation, which I always try to conclude with, which is just the key takeaways, and we look at it both from an academic and a career perspective.
Sure.
So the first thing in terms of the academic takeaways, maybe you can talk about these one by one, and we'll go through them. Go ahead.
Absolutely. I think the first academic key takeaway, I think I've kind of harped on this in my presentation on having some sort of expertise in at least one subject. This could be subject matter expertise, technical expertise, simply because it becomes your unique selling point. When you're interviewing with the folks, wherever it is, people hire you for something that either they can't do well themselves or they need support with. So they need you to kind of communicate to them what is it that you can be helpful with, right? What is that one key area of expertise or two key areas of expertise that you can help with? And this essentially becomes more important later on in your career. See, when you're a fresher, it's easier to kind of get away with this because most folks, when they're fresh of school, are more generic in their skill set, and recruiters are fine with that. But once you've had some years of work experience, recruiters want to pay you for some expertise. So that building that expertise, I think, is very critical, and more importantly, communicating that expertise. I think the second point is very closely tied to the first point, because sometimes you might realize that you don't have the expertise that is needed for a certain profession. And the very natural response to that is either taking courses or getting another degree to kind of fill those gaps. I did that. I'm sure Hamada, you did that. Many folks who went back to school did that because they saw a gap. But having said that, I think this is a really interesting time because of COVID. We know for a fact that many students who have got into school, are looking to defer admission quite wisely because they don't know what experience they're going to get out of school if COVID kind of persists. Also, the investment, right? Because you don't know how the market is going to be for the next year or 2 years, especially for people who want to do one-year programs. I would be very, very careful with what investment you're making. If you don't have any financial limitations, which I'm sure some of you would fall in that boat, and you see a clear gap in your CV, fair enough. I guess this would be a good time to then educate yourself when the market is anyways low, and then hopefully after 2 years, when things come back to track, you can use this education along with your prior experience to kind of make a case to pivot your career. The folks who don't have financial limitations, I think going back to school may not be a bad idea at this point. But for many of us who rely on loans, personal savings, and may not have the financial resources, I think you've got to be a little bit more careful. You might want to think of cases where going to schools where you probably have a free ride, getting scholarships, or looking at online courses like Coursera and a bunch of these other courses that are being shared online to kind of fortify or strengthen your skills that you see as gaps. So I think that is a very personal decision of going to school now or waiting and looking at online resources to strengthen your skill set.
Yeah, I think we we got a question from one of our listeners that asked that exact question, whether they should be applying for school, especially given the outstanding financial loans that would be coming into it. So I'm glad that you answered that question for our listener. I know that, when you were in school, you, as I said, you TA'd classes, you worked over the summers, so you're able to kind of replenish your own kind of your own finances just by the work that you did as a student. And I think that's also important to kind of know, is that there are opportunities as a student to be able to supplement your income and try to get scholarships. Even if you don't get it the first year, you can still try to get it the second year, and so forth. Or you can be committed to a job who would then end up pulling the tab for you and paying for your education as well, when you as you can negotiate that as part of your salary or as part of your package, your financial, your compensation package. I know I did that for law school. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the legal webinar, where I pretty much graduated with no debt because I taught classes every semester at Berkeley, and was able to thereby pay off all my debt, as well as work every summer at a different law firm and just paid off my debt that way. And I think that's something also to kind of be aware of. And also the concept of being, working and studying on your own is obviously very difficult. For some people, very difficult to have that discipline to do Coursera. I'm actually doing a Coursera course right now, which has been a nightmare because it's a subject I'm not very familiar with. And it's one that I think is very important to learn. But it takes a lot of discipline to sit down and do the work when you'd rather be doing something else otherwise. So there are limitations, but again, I'm taking a Coursera course. I'm trying to do a lot of the stuff that we're talking about now to future-proof my own career and give myself that extra skill set. I don't want to come out of COVID and say, so what did you end up doing? Oh, nothing, just the average, Netflix and chilling and just trying to find a job. But rather than, really creating that future-proofing concept around who you are and so forth, even from an educational space. Let's shift it over to the professional takeaways that you're going to provide our listeners as well. Here they are. Let's go one by one and knock those out. We can kind of bring this home and get a better sense of what people should be thinking about from a professional perspective in terms of future proofing.
Sure, absolutely. Again, I'll speak in the context of international development here, because I understand most of the viewers and listeners are interested in this space. I think one thing which is critical here, and this goes back to my earlier comment of being Indian at heart, but global in spirit. We're all proud citizens of our countries, but we need to be aware of what's going on globally and what issues need to be addressed there. I think international development, be it the UN, be it the World Bank, any other organization, you're seeing a huge push towards deploying folks in the field, and kind of reducing positions in global headquarters, like could be Washington DC, could be New York, could be Vienna. A lot of field positions are being opened in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, because there's this understanding that if you're in the field, if you're closer to the client who needs your support, you could be more effective. So I would advise folks to be more open to these field positions, not just be constricted by this thought of being in more developed countries, being in headquarters, whether it's DC, Vienna, New York, as I mentioned, because the truth of the matter is that you will see fewer positions opening there and more positions opening up in the field. And as someone who regularly travels for work, of course, this is pre-COVID-19, I will tell you that there's nothing like being in the field. When you're with the client, when you're actually, on the ground, you get a much better understanding of what challenges you're trying to mitigate and solve. I think I would definitely say be open to these field positions. They can be very rewarding. I think the second key thought is that international development, I think, is even more important today, given the crisis that we are facing with COVID-19 and even some of the other more long-term challenges like climate change, that we discussed earlier. So I think it will never go out of vogue. There's always a need for qualified and passionate people. And I repeat that it is extremely important for you to be passionate about it. Otherwise, you will not be happy, in that stream of work, because it's very different from a private sector job. As someone who has worked in the private sector and also in international development, I can safely tell you that you shouldn't be looking at jobs just because they're in demand or because they're in vogue. You must be thinking of something because it's passionate and because it's important. I think that is something to keep in mind. So international development will become more important during the crisis. There will be positions that open up. And I think the third point clearly relates to consulting opportunities. Many of you may not be aware of how international organizations work. There are various contracts, some of them short-term contracts, some of them more long-term contracts. I think quite a few short-term contracts will open, given the importance of dealing with this crisis, given the need for, as I mentioned, passionate and qualified individuals. So one thing that you could do is talk to people if you are interested in international development, talk to people at the World Bank, talk to people at the UN, Gavi, WHO, all these stellar international organizations. Talk to them about where you think the demand is and where you can fit. So again, coming back to the networking point that Hamada brought up earlier, it is critical in these times because let me tell you, many of these international organizations are huge, right? They're big organizations. It's very easy to get lost in what they do and not getting a clear picture of where you fit. And I will tell you this is without a doubt. The only way you can get that clarity is by talking to people. You will not get that information from the website because these organizations are huge. You will have to talk to someone who has been through this, who understands the landscape. For instance, I regularly do this. I go once or twice a year to the Harvard Kennedy School to talk to students on how they should look at international development and the World Bank and UN. So I encourage you to do that, to talk to people. And if you don't know anyone, feel free to write to people on LinkedIn. Folks are especially receptive to these sort of requests in these times, during this crisis. I get quite a few LinkedIn requests. I know other colleagues who get a lot of these cold LinkedIn requests, and we are, for the most part, pretty happy to help folks. So I would encourage you to talk to those folks. And I think the fourth one is really regarding remote work. This has now kind of become, quite common. I'm working remotely right now for the World Bank. A lot of my colleagues in other organizations are also working remotely. We don't know when this is going to be lifted. Obviously, safety is kind of paramount. So organizations will not take the risk of reopening their offices without having some assurance of how they're going to tackle this issue. So if you are someone who needs to work remotely because of your family, I mean, in the long term, if you want to work remotely in the long term because of your family issue or because of your location, this is something that will be more generously accepted moving forward, in my opinion. It's already the case. A lot of my colleagues, even before COVID-19, these are folks who are consultants with the World Bank. They work remotely. They could be based in London, they could be based in Vietnam, India. In fact, some of them are based in countries where the World Bank does not even have an office. But what really differentiates them, and this is something I must bring up, the reason they're able to so effectively get recruited in a remote capacity and deliver is they have something to, they have subject matter expertise, they have technical expertise, which makes people who they're working with comfortable, right? So you don't need to micromanage them. You know that they understand their subject and they can deliver. So that's why I go back to this technical expertise and subject matter expertise point. If you are able to clearly and cogently communicate that, and people are fine letting you work remotely because they are then confident that you can deliver wherever you are.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think these are fantastic takeaway points. We did have a question about that kept coming up that we were talking about taking on side projects and so forth and virtual work, so that even if you're based remotely, you can also work on other business ventures, or I guess even smaller projects to kind of develop your skill sets and so forth. And I think that's a very, very important factor that we've brought up multiple times. And I'm sure when you were in school, you were consulting on the side, trying to also expand your network and expand your horizons, and put your skills into or your studies into action. And I'm sure that's something that you're constantly aware of, because it's just as we talked about numerous times. It's always important to have a specialty if you can build one up. Again, for me, I could always fall back on law. You can always fall back on engineering. You use that as the core. And then from there, you can pivot outwards into all kinds of different areas that core allows you to build off of. And I think that's also important, to find that core that A, allows the flexibility and the cross functionality, but B, like you said, it has, it's one that's in demand, that is somewhat in vogue. And one that you're passionate about. I mean, would say in some ways I'm passionate about the law, but not absolutely in love with it. But it's been a good block. It's been a good launch pad for me. And it's been a good way of better understanding and improving my own skill sets. And I'm sure the same applies for you in engineering as well.
Absolutely, Hamada. I think it's always building on what you currently have to then define your trajectory. As I mentioned earlier, right? You're at point A, you want to go to point B, and then what's the bridge? But the thing is, you are at point A. Right. Being at point A is not something that should be discarded. I think I often get asked by people who think they're doing something now and then what they want to do is completely irrelevant.
Right.
I would never say any of your experience or education is irrelevant because it stays with you for life.
Right.
And in funny ways, it always helps you.
It does. It does. It's almost like it's almost like being at home now. I'm reusing stuff that I had bought that I had never used. I just found the purpose for it now that I'm stuck at home. It sounds like a different way of saying it, but the same thing. You could be studying something you don't think has much relevance in the today, but in a couple of years it comes up and you're like, oh, you have that conversation with somebody. You have that touch point because you studied it or you looked at it or you researched it, and then it can come back to the fray. So with that, I want to kind of close out and tell you guys about our next webinar, which is going to be next week. Not exactly the same time. I have actually a case that I've got to jump on. So Rahul was kind enough to move our webinar back an hour. But for next week, we're going to be steadfast at the 10 a.m. California time, 1 p.m. Eastern time, 6 p.m. GMT. And we're going to be focusing a little bit more about the business, the new business norms, and leveraging the MBA for that future. We're going to be talking to another good friend, Wharton graduate, and we may have another guest as well, talking about the differences in terms of small business, the growth of small businesses, also within Fortune 500s, what the future looks like, and how the MBA can best suit that. So again, that's going to be exactly this time next week, 10 a.m. California time. So tune in for that. It's going to be, again, on my LinkedIn Live, but also on Right Track's Facebook. And as always, guys, we tell you to please stay home, stay safe, stay sane, stay connected. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions for us, any questions for Rahul, always email us at info@righttrackadmissions.com so we can provide that information to you, and we'll always connect you with our speakers about any questions that you may have or any follow-up questions on what we've discussed today. Thank you very much, Rahul. As always, you've been a great friend, a great colleague. Note to the world, we are hoping and coming and collaborating together on teaching a remote class in Africa, hopefully in July. So I'm going to call you up on that one, Rahul, and we'll start plotting and planning how we're going to teach that course out there for a good friend of ours. And with that, I will wish you guys a pleasant day, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, everyone, and stay safe.
Bye-bye.